I know, let me try that again. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good. See how this is going to work? All right. I want to welcome you all to Winthrop tonight and to the John C. West Forum on Politics and Policies presentation of Palmetto Focus. This is a three-part series on issues in South Carolina. Tonight's the first part of the series, in which is Act 388 Revisited. I want to first of all tell you that we are streaming live on Facebook, so know that she may be panning the crowd. Judy Longshaw may be panning the crowd from time to time, so if you need an alibi, make sure you wave into the camera, okay? And also at the appropriate time at the end, we will also do a question and answer, so if you will keep that in mind, that we also want to make sure that our friends at home, those sleep-in participants, are also getting to hear and see what we're doing. We're pleased that you're with us tonight to discuss the history and implementation of Act 388 in South Carolina on this 10th anniversary of its enactment. I'm Elizabeth Owen. I'm an attorney with Morton & Geddes, a local law firm here in Rock Hill, and I'm on Geddes for underwriting this event, along with Robinson, Bradshaw, and Henson, and those attorneys in making this event possible and for us to have this very meaningful discussion. We also want to thank those at the West Forum, especially Katarina Moyan and her team, for putting this event together and for lining up our very distinguished guests. For those of you who don't know, the John C. West Forum on Politics and Policy was founded by the former South Carolina Governor West to train next generation of South Carolina leaders and to engage in a dialogue about politics and policy. The West Forum began here at Winthrop in 2008 and at USC in 2002. Before I turn to introduce our distinguished guest, I'd like to remind you all to turn off your personal devices, and if we can do that now, or at least silence them. That includes me too. I hope I've got mine on silent. If not, we won't take that call online too, right? Okay, we will hear from each of our speakers, and then after the speakers speak, we'll take questions from you. So please jot those down. The speakers may have questions of one another, and we want you to participate in this and for this to be a live discussion of this very meaningful topic. First, I want to introduce Dr. Holly Ulbrich. Dr. Ulbrich is an Alumni Distinguished Professor Emerita of Economics at Clemson University, specializing in state and local public finance. She's the author of 15 books, including a textbook in public finance, and has written and spoken extensively on tax, budget, and education finance issues. She has served as the consultant to many public agencies, from local school districts to the federal government, including also the World Bank. Thank you, Dr. Ulbrich, for being here with us tonight. Next, we'll be hearing from Mr. Ted Pitts, who's President and CEO of the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce. He took that position in January of 2015. Ted came to the Chamber after serving as the Chief of Staff for South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley and working for the Governor during his first term in office during her first term of office, 2011 to 2014. I was about to promote you as the Governor. I don't know whether you wanted that or not. Prior to his service with Governor Haley, he served in the South Carolina House of Representatives from 2003 to 2010, representing Lexington County. Mr. Pitts is from the business community, where he has a successful commercial real estate broker, and he is a partner with the South Carolina firm of Wilson Kibler. Ted also serves as a major in the South Carolina Army National Guard and is a veteran of the Operation Enduring Freedom Afghanistan. He's a graduate of Presbyterian College, where he currently serves on the Board of Trustees. He and his wife, Christina, have 3 children and call Lexington home. And I know he's with us tonight and not with them, as to help with the bed and bath routine, so we thank him very much for being with us despite his time as a devoted father as well.
I appreciate the night off.
I'm a working mother, Ted. I understand the night off. And last but certainly not least, we welcome Mr. Robert Davis, or otherwise known as Bob Davis. Mr. Davis is a native of Columbia, South Carolina. He graduated from the University of South Carolina with a double major in accounting and finance. He holds a master's degree in management from Central Michigan University. He's a Navy veteran, having served on board a nuclear submarine and retired with the rank of captain. His military decorations include submarine gold dolphins, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, and the Meritorious Service Medal with 2 gold stars. In his civilian career, he has served as a general auditor of SCE&G's parent company, SCANA Corporation, as the senior executive assistant for the Division of Business for the South Carolina Department of Education, and as the chief financial officer for Richland County School District Two, with over 25,000 students, a $220 million operating budget, and a $650 million construction program, building over 20 schools in over 15 years. Bob's awards include District Level Administrator of the Year from South Carolina Association of School Administrators, the prestigious Eagle Award from the Association of School Business Officials International, and the Outstanding School Business Official Award from the South Carolina Association of School Business Officials. Please join me in welcoming these speakers and give them a round of applause for being here. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Ulbrich. Yes, from there. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. This event could not have been more timely. There's a Legislative Tax Reform Committee gathering information in Columbia. Bob and I have both been there. Ted probably has too. And one question they're interested in is whether and how to reform Act 388. They can't actually repeal it. You just don't give relief and then take it away. Only God gets to do that. But they can tweak it. And at the end of my remarks, I'll suggest some possible tweaks. At the Strom Thurmond Institute, we have been watching property tax relief around the country for some time, up to 2006, in anticipation that the General Assembly was going to do something. Our legislators held hearings around the state in 2005 to get input about how people felt about the sales tax and the property tax, and it was pretty clear that some kind of swap was under consideration. When we looked at what other states had done or were contemplating, we found several patterns. One was to offer a floor level of property tax relief. Much like what South Carolina enacted in 1995, it covered the first $100,000 of market value for owner-occupied residential property, and we also had some additional earlier relief for the elderly. Some states offered relief also to veterans and disabled and other groups. A second kind of property tax relief used in about 3/4 of the states is called a circuit breaker. No electricity involved. It's designed to provide property tax relief when the tax bill exceeds some percentage of your income, typically in the 5 to 10% range. That targets tax relief to those who need it, and it doesn't lose the state nearly as much revenue, while protecting people from losing their homes to tax sales, which happens a lot less often than some people in South Carolina were claiming in 2006. So we threw that idea into the hopper, and it slid right through the hopper and into the circular file, because apparently poor people were not the ones that they were listening to. A third kind of relief, most notably in Michigan, was state-funded property tax relief. They send money to school districts in exchange for the school districts reducing their mill rates. Long before Act 388, Michigan raised the state sales tax from 4% to 6% and used the money to increase the state's share of school funding. And that kind of struck a chord in South Carolina. And just briefly, I'll mention a fourth popular form of relief is some constraint on increases in assessment. And a lot of people think the increase in assessment was in Act 388. It wasn't. It was a constitutional amendment requiring a separate act. I campaigned vigorously against it, but it's hard to resist what looks like tax relief with no strings attached. Even my youngest daughter, who should have known better, voted for it, called me up and said, "How was I supposed to vote on that last one?" Against. Let me go call my husband to get him to offset my vote. So I always said, as a result of my efforts, it only passed by a 78% to 22% margin, instead maybe 80-20. But I'm probably taking too much credit. Anyway, the plan was to increase, originally the plan was an increase in the state sales tax from 5% to 7%, and relief that would have included rental and commercial property, but only for taxes on taxes that pay for school operations. Well, we started looking at the impact of combined state and local tax rates with the local option sales tax up to 9%. Thinking about our in-state merchants, we could see lots of you folks in York County doing your shopping in Charlotte. We can go to Commerce. Low Country can go to Savannah. And the internet was also a growing source of sales. So we didn't want to do that to our in-state merchants, so they whittled the tax increase down to, as we like to say, the penny. And limiting the relief to just owner-occupied residential property. That made it less fair but more affordable. The story reported in a state newspaper was that the final plan was written late at night on the back of a takeout chicken box. One critic of the plan said they might have done better if they'd ordered pizza. So what we got was a sales tax hike and complete removal of taxes on owner-occupied property for school operations, in addition to the exemption already in place. It was guaranteed by the general fund, so if the penny didn't raise enough money, and we knew from the beginning it wouldn't, then the general fund would make up the difference. Been running close to $100 million a year drain on the general fund for 10 years. It was sort of obvious that this was a tax increase that fell heavily on the poor and the working classes and large families and, yes, business firms, offset by a large amount of tax relief that went to homeowners who had homes worth more than $100,000. Your average 1920s vintage mill house or mobile home did not qualify. They were already getting all the relief they were going to get. Many poorer school districts had almost no homes worth more than $100,000 and got very little. Legislators had to buy support for this plan from the small rural counties, so they came up with a provision guaranteeing every county. We don't have county school districts, we have individual school districts. 29 single district counties, and then the rest are multi-district. But the funds were per county, and it was at least $2.5 million. So, for example, if a county got $400,000 in property tax relief, they get another $2.1 million from the state. The problem with this was it wasn't related to the number of students, and it's calculated county by county, even though the aid goes to school districts. 17 of our 46 counties have more than one school district. Some are poor, some aren't. The aid per student varied widely. Despite the shadow of the Abbeville case about school funding hanging over their heads, legislators managed to distribute a significant amount of the aid to non-poor districts and failed to help a lot of poor ones. There's one more quirk in the law that's worth mentioning. While school districts could still collect debt millage for school construction on owner-occupied residential property, they no longer had access to what they call the lease purchase method for building new school buildings, which our faster growing districts, including those in York County, have been using for a number of years. So they took away that method of funding school construction, and school districts who don't have much fiscal power or particularly hard hit in construction. But for us, as the most disturbing effect of Act 388 was the impact on the level and distribution of state money for school operations. By 2010, districts were receiving an average of $13.82 per pupil. That's $1,382, not $13.82, in property tax relief. So if you combined Act 388 with the cuts in our big funding program, the Education Finance Act, 42 school districts saw a decline in their operating revenue the first 3 years of the Act, including 16 of the ones classified as poor. 21 districts saw increases of 20% or more. Only 3 of them were poor, and all 3, Lee, McCormick, and Allendale, got it basically because of the minimum guarantee. 39 districts, including 19 primarily poor districts, saw a decline in total state aid in the first 3 years after Act 388. So EFA, Education Finance Act, is the primary equalizer across school districts. Act 388 became the primary disequalizer, even as we were in year 13 of the Abbeville case, which is now in year 25, if I count correctly. No, 23, sorry. We also looked at the widening gap of property tax burdens between owner-occupied property and rental and commercial property, something I know this chamber is very interested in, especially along the coast where there's a lot of second home and rental property, and they've found ways to shift it from one category to the other to significantly cut their tax burden, because the burden on a rental home as opposed to an owner-occupied home can be as much as 3 times as high. I do believe that broadening the base of the sales tax is the best way to raise more money with the least protest, and particularly taxing more services. But there's also some things in Act 388 that should be considered. One is maybe to put a ceiling on the property value receiving property tax relief, maybe $250,000 or $300,000 per unit. That would generate some extra funds for school operations and cut the drain on the state general fund. Another possible reform is to do something with a minimum $2.5 million per county, and I've talked to the legislature about that possibility. And we really need to look more closely at the increasingly unequal treatment of owner-occupied and rented homes or apartments. It's discouraged the development of new rental units, which is important to companies coming in, and it's important to young people starting out and seniors who no longer want to be responsible for home ownership. So we have a shortage now of rental units. And finally, and Bob's going to talk more about this, we can't separate Act 388 from our overall system of funding public schools, and that needs a significant overhaul, and I understand that that's in the work. So perhaps if the legislature revisits Act 388, that may help pave the way to reform our hodgepodge, multi-source, antiquated, inequitable system of state aid for school districts and settle the issues raised in the Abbeville case once and for all. And if that happens, maybe Act 388 will not be such a bad thing after all.
I'd like to applaud that.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ulbrich. And now we'll go to you, Ted.
Thank you. And I'll talk briefly. As Elizabeth said, I've worn a couple hats. I got elected to the General Assembly in 2002, and the main plank in my platform in Lexington County is the guy that had been there. I was running against an incumbent, hadn't done anything about the property tax freight train that was running away. Property taxes in Lexington County continued to increase, and my voters were looking for a solution. Now, the legislative process is not clean, as everybody knows, and the old saying that Congress or the General Assembly does two things well, and the first is nothing, and the second is overreact and offer bad solutions to problems. Act 388 was presented as a solution to help owner-occupants with property tax relief. I was in the commercial real estate business, and in those meetings, I raised the concern that you could be shifting the burden to non-owner occupants because that would be the only place you could go. Also, I raised the concern that that when you cap the amount of value a property can increase, you end up with two commercial buildings sitting next door to each other, exactly identical, and one of them's taxes being far higher than the other taxes because it had transferred. And it has hurt the sale of investment property in this state. It's hurt the sale in some ways with second homes across the state, with rental property and commercial properties. There are some businesses that make decisions not to improve their facility because once they improve it, it allows the county to come in and reassess it. But ultimately, 388 was a solution to a problem. And, we can ignore that the problem was there, but it existed. And voters around this state, and Dr. Ulbrich mentioned with the overwhelming support it passed, after it passed, I sent a mail piece to every member in my district and said, I didn't say it this bluntly, but I just said, you're welcome. You now have, owner-occupants now have property tax relief. And many folks saw that as a good thing. And when you talk about what Act 388 intended to do, it did it, and it did it well. It was to give owner-occupants property tax relief. So, the unintended consequences we'll talk a little bit about, but, I would tell you that what was set out to be accomplished was accomplished. At the last, you talk about the chicken box and Representative Bill Cotty and negotiating the deal. Typically when the House and the Senate are so far apart on an agenda item, usually they bring back to each body something that's probably never even been debated in each body. And in this case, that's kind of what happened. Sales tax exemption on groceries, basically Republicans put that in there to get the Democrat minorities in each body's support, and it worked. And they also put in there that floor, that minimum level that they gave to some of the rural counties also. So, a lot of people, it's funny now to see a lot of people shoot at Act 388, but I'll tell you in the General Assembly, members in the House and the Senate were very proud of the work they had done to provide tax relief to owners, to homeowners. And now let's talk a little bit about the unintended consequences. And and I guess live those now at the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber actually opposed the bill when it was moving through the General Assembly. And actually my predecessor, Otis Rawl, tells the story of the Speaker of the House calling his board chair and saying, y'all better get your tail in here because we got a problem, and telling them they need to back off on trying to stop the proposal. And they told them very respectfully that we can't support this proposal because it ultimately is going to shift a tax burden to the business community. So let's talk about a little bit about some of that shift. So in 05-06, owner-occupant property generated about $960 million of revenue. Fast forward to where we are today, so about $960 million of revenue. It's up to now about $1.2 billion. Not a big increase when you look at the 10 years that have passed. Now let's move to 6% property. 6% property in 05-06 generated about $1.8 billion a year for local governments and school districts. It now generates $3 billion a year. So you look at the difference in percentage of increase, you see the shift that has occurred. And, the problem is not really with the big guys, because the Boeings and the Michelins and those guys, they negotiate fee and lieu deals. So, the big projects, because, I'll have people say, jobs haven't quit coming to South Carolina because of Act 388. The business community must be okay with it because Torrey's going to Spartanburg, Boeing's going to North Charleston. And you say, no, actually, the only reason they're here is because they could negotiate a fee-lieu deal. But the guy that's getting it stuck to them, quite frankly, is the small business guy that doesn't get a fee-lieu deal. They have to pay what comes. In Lexington School District 1, which is where I live, a $300,000 property that's owner-occupant, the house I live in, is about $2,000 in property taxes, my total bill. And that includes some bond indebtedness and the other taxes that are assessed by the county. That same $300,000 value, if you move it to a non-owner occupied property, not a manufacturing property at 10%, but at 6%, you're talking an $8,000 bill. So you look at the difference between an owner occupant and you look at a commercial property. So if the mom and pop owns a building and sells Subway sandwiches or something, they continue every year. Because school districts, you hear them say this, they say, if, we're capped, so I got to get a little bit each year because that rainy day may come and I can't get everything I need to cover expenses that year. So you'll see some of that take place. It continues to have unintended consequences. So let's talk a little bit about solutions. When you talk about solutions, I think the General Assembly and Chairman Tommy Pope, who's actually chairing the tax committee that the House is working on, and the House gets a lot of credit, and I'll say this, Speaker Lucas, since he's shown up and taken charge of the House, they don't sit back and wait for the session to get here to start working on problems. They take the off session to work on the pension issue or the roads issue and now the tax issue, and it's not an easy nut to crack. But let's talk about solutions. I don't think solutions, I have people tell me this, let's just undo it. Solutions are not going to include going back and taxing owner occupants. The politics of that just don't work. There can be some piece of that is part of the solution. But I think there's a solution that can be found, and primarily I think the General Assembly is motivated because the thing that Dr. Ulbrich talked about is the general fund, which is all the tax revenue. Currently, Act 388 eats out of the general fund. And over the last 10 years, it's been about $1 billion. So that $1 billion, it could be spent on roads, or it could be spent on base student cost allocation, or it could be spent on other things, higher ed or Medicaid. Currently has to be pulled out of the general fund to cover the shortage that occurred. And we all know, and we've seen it in so many cases, that government math is just bad. And actually, government ought to be against the law for government to do math. They ought to have to outsource it to the private sector, in my opinion, because the private sector would get it right, or at least closer to it is. Because, we talk about Act 388, but the lottery scholarships eat out of the general fund. So we passed a bill there, and we didn't cap it. Whoever qualifies gets a scholarship. And so then the general fund, because we don't have enough lottery revenue, the general fund has to feed that. Again, government math doesn't work, and that's why any solution that the General Assembly's talking about, and I'm not pointing fingers, I was part of the establishment, I guess, if you say that. You know, whatever the next solution is, has to be careful that we don't have more unintended consequences that make it worse. So ultimately, I think solutions could come in the form of, you know, I use this example, we're building 2 nuclear reactors in the same county that already has a nuclear reactor. And if you look at the amount of revenue that generates for a school district, it all goes to one school district. But everybody that buys that electricity buys it off the grid that's created by that one plant. So really the investment benefits a broader population than just the folks in the school districts. You know, for too long, I guess, you know, we have a system where school districts, and I look at Lexington 1, most of SCAN or SE&G's tax base is actually right across, I mean, it sits behind the dam in some cases, which is right between Lexington, Richland 5 and Lexington 1, but most of that tax base actually goes to Lexington 5. And now we've done some things in Lexington County that have an industrial park that provides taxes or revenue to all the school districts that the county paid for. So we've got to look at how we pay for schools differently. And, you know, school district's going to tell you we just need more money. I mean, that's the answer. And people say, why can't you solve this problem? You know, the business community is opposed to it and schools are opposed to it. And I'll say, well, the problem is that they both don't dislike it, but they dislike it for different reasons. The business community doesn't like it because they're paying more in taxes, and the school districts don't like it because their ability to pay their bills through tax revenue has been inhibited. So how do you find a solution that has the taxpayer or the owner-occupant on one side of this issue, the business community on another side of this issue, and school districts on a different side of the issue? So it's extremely tough, but I think that some solutions, some out-of-the-box solutions like looking at how we have maybe a statewide millage to help offset that. Some of those things have to be looked at because for too long, school districts have operated in silos. And, you know, we can talk about how much it costs to educate a student in South Carolina, but it's different across the state. And, you know, and until we probably drill down on that, so if you're looking for a solution, let's drill down on the actual cost that it costs to educate a student, because that's what the business community would do. The business community would say, how much does it cost to educate a student? All right, it's X. All right, how do we get to X? And they would look for the problem in that way, as opposed to the current problem is, how much less money am I getting, or how much more taxes am I paying? So that's been the driver in the argument, when ultimately I think we've got to drill down to what does South Carolina think is the right amount of dollars to educate one of its students. So, but I'm hopeful that, you know, the leadership of Tommy and others in the House, that we can address Act 388 in a way that is both beneficial to being able to operate schools and also doesn't shift the tax burden further to the business community. So, thank you.
And now, Bob, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending tonight's panel discussion, and thank you for your support of public education and for your interest in the general welfare of our Palmetto State. Allow me to give my special thanks to Robinson, Bradshaw, and Henson, and to Morton and Getty's firm for sponsoring this. We need more of these discussions held throughout our state. And what an honor I find it to be included on a panel with Dr. Holly Ulbrich and Ted Pitts. I've known both of these people for a fair number of years, and let me thank them for their outstanding service to our state. Thank you both. Yes, they're here. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Chief Financial Officer of one of the fastest growing school districts in the state of South Carolina for some 15 years, about in the middle of that term, I was there in 2006 when Act 388 was passed. I had what I would call a rather unique vantage point for looking at the vicissitudes, isn't that a wonderful word, of this far-reaching piece of legislation. I think, obviously, as we've stated, Act 388 is good news for homeowners. Is that the case? I'm a homeowner. Did I welcome it from that standpoint? Yes. as a chief financial officer of a school district, as someone who's actually worked on education funding proposals considered by our legislature, as a practitioner in the school district finance world, I learned to rue the day of the passing of Act 388. My task tonight, one other thing. I knew the principal author of Act 388, and I can assure you he had no idea of the consequences that were going to arise, the unforeseen consequences that arise. He had some marching orders, he had a task to perform, and he in fact did that very well, again, with some baggage we found along the way. My task tonight is to convey to you in about 10 minutes the perspective of a school district finance officer laboring under Act 388. What is Act 388? Again, is it education funding legislation? No, that was never the intent. What was it? Property tax relief. And again, for property tax homeowners, it's a deal. It also, though, as already been mentioned by Dr. Ulbrich and Ted, it imposed a cap on what local governments can and cannot do in raising revenue. Prior to the passage of Act 388, I believe Dr. Ulbrich would have told you that South Carolina had a very sound tax structure. We had the proverbial three-legged stool, property sales and income tax. The revenue streams from all three were roughly equal. It was the best taxing system to weather economic storms. Then what do? We pass Act 388. And the first thing we do is we take the property leg off the stool for school operations. And then what happens? That was passed in 2006. What happened in 2007, 2008, 2009? Here, we're in the worst economic recession since the days of the Great Depression. We're more dependent on sales tax under 388, and what's the most volatile revenue stream we have? Sales tax revenue. What's the revenue stream we don't have from a school district standpoint? The property tax revenue. What's the most stable form of revenue? The property tax. As a finance officer, am I beginning to see a bad day coming? And the answer is yes. All right, again, 07, 08, and 09, and as Dr. Ulbrich and Ted pointed out, the sales tax revenues plummeted, and we had to go to the general fund to make it up, to honor the pledge to our homeowners to take care of their taxes under Act 388. And Ted said $1 billion basically was the price tag that we picked up on that. And again, that's money out of the general fund, so that doesn't pay for roads. It doesn't pay for the social services. And yes, it doesn't pay for education. There's a couple of school finance officers in the audience, and they can tell you about what it's done as far as the Education Finance Act funding. All right, as to its the impact from the viewpoint of a practitioner, where do I begin? Let me set the table for you. The first is that the cornerstone of state funding in South Carolina for education is the Education Finance Act of 1977. It was passed 40 years ago. At the time, it was a national model for funding education. A number of other states copied it. Has it served us well? The answer is yes. Does it need some work? The answer is yes, okay? But that legislation created something we call the base student cost, going back to Ted's point about trying to calculate what it would cost to educate a student. So in statute, there's a base student cost. Now here's the problem, okay? Or a problem, a concern. We don't have problems, we have concerns, don't we? The concern is that the legislature has been able to fund the base student cost at its statutory level maybe 6 times in the last 40 years. I'm sure my friends here at Winthrop University would like to talk about the funding of higher education while we're here. But again, if we had fully funded the Education Finance Act, we probably wouldn't be having as intense a discussion of Act 388 as we're seeing now. Another point, the Education Finance Act set up that it would be a 70-30 split. 70% of the funding would come from the state and 30% from local taxpayers. But that was the ideal split. It also took into consideration what the ability of a school district was to raise revenue. What was its tax base like? And it was tailored. As a result, we have a huge spectrum in the state. As a result, some school districts, they don't get 70% of the base student cost, they get 90%. And some of the school districts in South Carolina, because of their property tax base, get $0 from the state of South Carolina. Does someone see a potential inequity problem? For discussion purposes, let's talk about the fact that you've got to raise that 30%. How do you raise that 30%? You raise it from your local tax base. Again, non-homeowners. And also understand that if your local taxing authority increases your millage, and we talk about millage and taxes, if they increase it 1 mil, wherever you live in South Carolina, it costs you $6. You got that? $6 for 1 mil. In my old district, a 1 mil increase would generate about $270,000. Now hang on to that number. If we walked across the district line to the next door district, that 1 mil increase costing $6 would generate about $550,000 in a neighboring district. And if I got in my car and decided to drive down Highway 378 to go to Myrtle Beach and found myself in Horry County, that 1 mil increase costing $6 would generate $1.7 million. And then if I get on Highway 17 and drive down to Charleston, and I get to Charleston, that 1 mil increase, $6, generates $2.25 million. And if we're not tired of driving yet, let's get back in my car for one more stop. Let's go to Manning, South Carolina, where a lawsuit was filed 30 years ago, which has made its way through the courts and has made it to the South Carolina Supreme Court. And the justices have concurred there's a problem, and they have directed the legislature to fix the problem. But back to Act 388. A 1 mil increase in Manning generates $60,000. Does someone see an inequity problem in our state? All right, what's all I got to do with Act 388? Let's back up a second. In 2002, 2003, and 2004, before Act 388, the state of South Carolina had some major funding concerns. Those years, we had multiple mid-year state budget cuts in 02 and 03 and 04 because of a lagging economy, okay? Now let me talk about a mid-year budget cut if you're a finance officer in a school district. If they come out and announce, we're gonna have a 1% budget cut, okay? You got that number? Well, hang on a second. 90% of a school district's operating costs are salary and fringe benefits. So they've got some discretion, Dr. Prosser, over about 10%. So if that 1% cut is not a 1% cut, what is it? It's a 10% cut of your discretionary. And if it's mid-year and you're already halfway through the year, it's not 1% of 10%, it's 1% of 5%, it's a 20% cut. And what do you do to deal with it? And you're in the business world, you're dealing with economic challenges, you don't see, what do you do? Well, you cut cost, but what's your largest expenditure? Salaries and fringe. So do we start cutting support staff? Do we start cutting teachers' pay? Does someone see, again, some concerns? All right, let's go back to my district. In my district, in 02, 03, and 04, what we were able to do was we were able to turn to our local taxpayers and say, please provide some additional revenue. Not for new schools, not for new bells and whistles, but just to keep us where we were so we wouldn't have to increase pupil-teacher ratios. And I was the finance guy, but the educators beat it into me that pupil-teacher ratios were the key to a quality education. Hopefully you keep them low, hopefully you lower them, or at least hopefully you keep them steady. So we in 02, 03, and 04 went to our local taxpayers and said, help us out, and they did. Now here's the rub. Act 388 virtually eliminates that as an option because of the limits. Act 388 truly restricts what local governments can do. All right, let's go back to Manning. The CFO in a poor district, what can he do? He probably doesn't even have a tax base that he could attach to any real degree, okay? And most of my colleagues in the districts tell me there are other problems, sometimes just political considerations where they couldn't get significant help no matter the situation they were facing. Back to a growing school district like mine, we were a residential community. We had a limited infrastructure tax base. We were growing 500 kids a year. 500 kids a year, 20-to-1 pupil-teacher ratio. We need to hire 25 teachers just to keep you where you are. How do you handle that?
And build a school every 2 years.
And build a school every 2 years. Thank you. A colleague of mine told me that because Act 388 took the homes off the property tax rolls, they were foregoing $60 million in revenue over the last 6 years because they had 6,000 new homes built in their school district over that period. And if 6,000 new homes are built, are there more children? Are there more demands? Do someone see a concern here? All right. Not part of Act 388, as Dr. Ulbrich pointed out, but accompanying it was the 15% cap on assessments. And what does that do? That also limits potential revenue. It limits potential revenue also on the debt service side for your properties that are not impacted by 388. It limits it there. The other thing is a colleague of mine looked at it, and over about 6 years, that 15% cap has probably had them forego about $20 to $25 million. Again, foregone revenue. Is it a tax cut? No. Is it a tax cap? The answer is yes. And again, is it revenue that they would have had there not been Act 388 or this? And it's the potential for that revenue. The local taxing authorities decide. One other aspect, school districts, Act 388 applies only to school districts. When you look at cities and counties, a school district, particularly a one like my district, we probably relied on about the local taxes about 60% of our revenue. A city and a county generally allows about 40%. So it really impacts school districts. And again, Act 388 limits any potential funding increase to the growth in the population of the district, not the number of students, but to the growth in the general population. Suppose you're in one of these small districts and your growth is 0. What's your revenue growth? 0. It also limits it to CPI, the Consumer Price Index. There have been years when the CPI has been 0, no increase. It's been steady. So what do you do if you're in one of those districts? And if you're in one of those districts, and I'm the finance officer, here's what I do. I turned to the school district's fund balance. In South Carolina, school districts with fund balances are widely criticized for having fund balances. But let me tell you, unfortunately, revenue streams aren't normal and across the board and steady. There are a couple of peaks and there's a ton of valleys. And if you don't have a fund balance to weather you through those valleys, what do most districts in South Carolina do? They issue TANs, tax anticipation notes. They go out and borrow the money to meet the day-to-day operating cost. And what do you pay when you borrow money? You pay interest. Where does that money come from? That money comes from the classroom. Ladies and gentlemen, I could go on. I did promise to do this in 10 to 12 minutes.
He's still got 4 pages over there. I don't know if he's going to make it.
The bottom line was and is Act 388 good news for homeowners? The answer is yes. Is it good news for anyone, including the business community? Is it good news for the state of South Carolina in general? Is it good news for education funding? The answer is no. And what can we do about it? You've heard 2, I think, marvelous suggestions tonight where we could possibly start. Apparently repealing Act 388 is not an option. Well, what can we do? Toward that end, the South Carolina Association of School Administrators, the South Carolina School Boards Association, and the South Carolina Association of School Business Officials worked together on a funding proposal for school districts, for public K-12 education. That proposal, H3627, which was sponsored by Representative Jenny Horn, was introduced in 2015. It addresses a couple of points that Ted mentioned. You remember the power plants, a uniform millage rate? That's in that proposal. A statewide millage, that's in that proposal. And as someone who worked on developing that plan, let me tell you, is it a perfect plan? The answer is no. Is it a solid, concrete step in the right direction? The answer is yes. And this old finance officer will tell you that's where we need to start discussion as to how we fund education in South Carolina. And one short personal story. 2 years after Act 388 passed, I was at a meeting with some educators and some legislators. And it was down at the State House. And the meeting got a little heated. And at one point in the meeting, one of the legislators wanted to know exactly what we thought about Act 388. And the words left my mouth before I could call them back. I told those gentlemen that in the history of South Carolina, Act 388 was the second worst decision we had ever made. The worst decision was our state's decision to fire on Fort Sumter. And I turned to my boss, Dr. Prosser, and apologized to him, and he said, "Don't worry about it, Bob, I agree with you." So I breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, I think, ladies and gentlemen, we live in a beautiful state. From our beaches, our sea islands, our marshes, the rolling hills, the magnificent mountains, we've got wonderful people, a vibrant people, a God-fearing people who want the best for their children. What do we need in this state? We need courage. We need determination. And we need some inspired leadership across our state to help us wrestle with this problem. And I, for one, like a good fight, and I hope tonight is at least a step in the right direction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you for those presentations. I know they were very meaningful part of tonight, and I appreciate I've certainly learned a lot as well. At this point in time, we're going to enter into the question and answer phase of this, and they're going to all stay for questions. What we're going to do, though, if you have a question, even though I'm a trial lawyer, and it's really hard for me for everybody to do it in an orderly fashion and raise your hand, we're not going to object. If you'll raise your hand if you have a question, Katerina Moyan is going to come find you, and we're going to make sure that our folks at home can hear all of the questions and the answers, but we need the microphone to do that, okay? And remember, you want to get credit for being here and if you need that alibi, okay? So let's start out. Who has a question? Yes?
What's next?
Well, Katerina's on her way. Even though the question is, what's next? That's quite an open-ended question. Okay. Who wants to take that one? All right, Dr. Ulbrich.
I'll share too.
Yeah, I'm sure we all have answers to, and some of them were laid on the table. For example, Ted talked about getting a good handle on what it actually costs to educate a student. We do this. Bob and I were part of a team of business people, education people, government people, and a couple of academics working very hard with weekly presentations to exactly cost out what it takes, how many teachers, how many librarians, how many maintenance staff, how many secretaries. There's a standard procedure. It's like a formula and brought in a consultant to help us with it to cost it out. That was done in 2007. It's when they asked us to update base student costs this year, I said, yeah, can you find the report we did in 2007 and we can start from there? So we can update base student costs till the cows come home, but if the legislature won't fund it, it's not going to do any good. But the cost work is being done. The other one is the proposal that both of my colleagues mentioned. That also came out of the work we did with the State Department of Education in 2007, and that is we looked at what other states were doing, and the formula we have for deciding whether you get 70% or 80% or 20% based on your tax-paying ability. It doesn't work anymore. The index doesn't work because we've taken homeowner property out of it. So we proposed a uniform statewide millage, and it worked very simply. And we didn't want it to be levied by the General Assembly because everybody down here says if they take away our property tax, they won't send it back, which could happen. So there's a certain amount of mistrust at the local level. But what we suggested is that everybody levies something. Make up a number. The number we used was 100 mils because the arithmetic was really easy. Everybody levies 100 mils on their tax base. That's what they raise. Then the government says, the General Assembly says, okay, we need so many $1,000s per pupil. This is what you were able to raise locally. Let's see what we have to add to it through our various streams to bring it up to that level. And that's something everybody can understand. I have a PhD in economics. I have been studying and teaching this stuff for 40 years. I have to go back every time and look at the EFA formula and say, how does that work again? So if I have trouble with it, people who have other things to do with their lives besides work on education, finance, and taxes probably have a lot more difficulty with it. So I think those are two places that we can start.
All right, thank you.
You know, and I would just say that, and this is not a criticism, it's just a reality, is that educators, when they go to members of the General Assembly, they just talk about needing more money. And then the first time you say, all right, we got too many school districts. Let's take a look at consolidating school districts. So, you know, school leaders and locals say, oh, no, you can't do that. That's, you know, it's home rule, you know, whatever the issue is. So I think to really accomplish and to be able to address education funding, school leaders are going to have to come to the table and willing to look at other reforms. Because I'll tell you, it'll fall on deaf ears for the most part. They'll give more money when there's more money to be had, but if you haven't read the paper, there's a pension issue that probably is $40 billion and probably is going to affect the state's AAA credit rating if they don't do something to address it. That's got to be addressed. So I think ultimately the next step is for educators to sit down and look at other structural reforms that they have been opposed to. You know, when I was in the House, I introduced in Lexington County, we got 4.5 school districts. And I introduced something like, let's just put a minimum level of kids that can be in a school district, and let's don't even have the state tell districts how to consolidate. Let's just say if you fall under, you know, 2,000 students, you can't get state funding anymore, and those districts will figure out how to move student populations to be more efficient. But we have school districts in this state in Dillon County that I think they have less than 1,000 students. 3 districts. And, you know, you talk about the issues there and that issue, but you talk about consolidation, and I'll give Sumter County credit. Democrats and Republicans in Sumter County, Merle Smith and David Weeks, who were in the House when I was there and in the House there, they basically told that county that we're going to consolidate you. And they came along and ended up helping make that happen. And I think people in Sumter County will tell you that the students across the county benefited from that consolidation. So I think if educators just continue to say, we need more money, we aren't getting the money that we need, I think it's going to go nowhere. But I think if educators will come to the table and be willing to look at other reforms, let's understand how much it costs to educate a student, and let's figure out the most efficient way to educate that student. And they're going to say, I just need the money. And what we need to say is, let's figure out if the schools in your area are the right sizes, are they shrinking or growing? And a facility analysis done. But I think ultimately Act 388 is, and I live in a fast-growing school district, and it is a problem. I will tell you, if you only have residential growth disproportionately in Lexington District 1 and in Bob's district, Richland District 2, most of the growth is residential growth. And the General Assembly has taken the ability to get tax revenue from residential growth. And you know who uses our schools? You know why people move to Lexington School District 1? They moved to Lexington School District 1 and drive in traffic that's getting work to Columbia that takes an hour now to get to work because they want their kids in those schools, but yet they're not being asked to pay for that service that they're receiving, and the property values benefit from those schools. So I think the structural issues got to be addressed as a next step, and then I think probably 388, because it is a problem for so many different constituencies, I think it's something that the General Assembly is willing to tackle and going to have to work on.
Hey, a good amen.
Thank you.
Let me just make one more comment. There are limits to the gains that you can get from consolidating school districts, however, because if you are a small rural school district, and you consolidate with another small rural school district, you still got kids scattered very thinly with high transportation costs and smaller classes so the kids don't live on the bus. So there are just higher costs in rural areas, whether it's one big rural area or a bunch of little rural areas. So there are some cost savings there, but it's not necessarily the answer to the General Assembly's prayer.
And there's also a problem with districts being too large to effectively manage and operate.
Correct. And I'll tell you, educators, and I'm not criticizing, but every time you talk about school district consolidation, they'll tell you why it's not a good idea. And that's not how you move the needle on funding for education. I know that's not what you were doing.
I'm not saying it's not a good idea. I'm just saying it's not going to be as much of a solution.
And if you look at outcomes, so ultimately when we look at education, I'm not concerned necessarily on how much the state's spending, but you look at outcomes, like what are we getting for the investment? So if you look at outcomes, it's really not predicated on the size of the school district that students are in. So, you can't really tie outcomes to the size of a district. And actually, if you look at spending, it's just the same way. You look at Greenville and Charleston, those two models, and the efficiency, both of them are county-wide school districts, which I wouldn't advocate every county have a county-wide school district, but I would advocate that we have a floor and maybe we have a ceiling, and school districts operate in the most efficient manner if they operate between those two numbers.
Okay. I think we have a question in the back.
Yeah, thank you for being here tonight. My question is whether you feel that the look at the property tax system is going to be broad enough to take into consideration a lot of the sources of revenue that have been eliminated other than owner-occupied dwellings. And what I'm referring to is in 1976, I believe it was, we had an amendment to the South Carolina Constitution which permitted the legislature to provide for property taxes based on the use of the property. And one of the results of that was that agricultural property was taken virtually off the books, which was a nutty thing to do, but that's what happened. Among other things, I'm a farmer. I have a farm out in the Bethesda community here. I recently bought some additional acreage. I paid $12,000 an acre for it. My neighbors have paid similar amounts for their property. I received my property tax bill last week. How much do you think I pay per acre that I paid $12,000 an acre for? The answer is 52 cents. 52 cents an acre, where if that same value for the 6-acre parcel was on anything else, particularly on a business, would be near $1,400, and I'm paying 52 cents. That's just nuts. But that's what we have as part of our property tax system. And I tell you, I've followed this as long as you guys have. And the thing, where this all began was really with that removal of agricultural property from our property tax base. And ever since, everybody's been trying to figure out how to dodge the enormous shift to homes, to businesses, to whatever. That's when it all started. And I think the legislature would do us all a favor if they would also, just as you, Mr. Pitts, are saying, the school people always say this and they always say that. But when you talk to the legislature about agricultural exemption, they always say, oh, we can't do anything about that. Well, it's time to do something about it. Thank you.
Dr. Ulbrich would like to respond.
I just want to make a comment that a number of states that have farm and forest exemptions, you have to demonstrate a certain minimum level of farm-related income in order to qualify.
And that's the way it works in North Carolina.
Yeah, here, I think it's got to be 5 acres, and you can plant it in pine trees, and you're a tree farmer.
You don't even have to plant it.
Well, I guess you'd have to claim that you'd plant it, maybe. I wouldn't want to lie to the tax collector.
Easy. Okay. All right. I think we have another question here.
Hi. Thank you again for being here at Winthrop. as the General Assembly ponders tax reform, you know, we're told that there are about $3 billion in exemptions that are left on the table. If, and I know it's a big if there could be some agreement on eliminating some of those exemptions, where would you suggest those new revenues be applied?
First of all, a thought on sales tax exemptions. Working with Dr. Harry Miley and some others, we started out looking at sales tax exemptions about which ones we might be able to repeal. And we quickly realized that we would have 5,000 consultants in the room with the legislature the next morning if we proposed eliminating any of them. And so our thought was, well, don't eliminate any of them. Just perhaps reduce them a little bit. Maybe drop all sales tax exemptions by a factor. If you did that, at least it'd be equal treatment. So again, that's one thought. As far as what they would do with the revenue is another question that would be at the mercy of the legislature. And I threw away my crystal ball on that subject a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, sales tax exemptions are the cool thing to talk about. Let's do away with sales tax exemptions. But does grandma want to pay sales tax on her prescription drugs? Because when you look at the large exemptions, you're talking about prescription drugs, you're talking about groceries, you're talking about the taxes paid on motor fuel. So, you know, that's always mentioned. And they're the largest bulk of those sales, your exemption on your utility bill. You know, there's some competitiveness issues that would have to be worked out if you're going to look at exemptions, like the sales tax exemption for manufacturers in their utility bill. You know, our property taxes are in a place, we got business licensing fees. So when you look at the tax structure and people just want to look at the tax structure on the local level or the state level, you can't do that. You've got to look at them together. But I do think there are some small sales tax exemptions that the General Assembly may actually consider doing away with. But I'll tell you that you talk about special interest groups. When you propose taking away a sales tax exemption, you do not realize how many people thought that was important or have been told that's important, and they need to call their legislator. And I used to always joke that if you could get 5 people to call my office, I thought it was a problem. You know, it was like that was the breaking point. If 5 people would take the time, and not one of these robocalls that they get patched in and they don't know why they're talking to you, but if they proactively picked up the phone call. So you talk about the small amount of people that actually get the legislators' attention. It doesn't take much, and those sales tax exemptions. I remember, you know, one time in the budget, or it seemed like every year in the budget, Jimmy Merrill would try to remove the exemption on ink. And we're like, why do you want to remove the exemption on ink? And he's like, I'm going after the newspaper guys. Those guys don't pay sales tax on ink. They're always writing bad stuff about me. They need to pay more in taxes. And I can tell you that it'd be 12 o'clock midnight, and the Lexington Chronicle owner, Jerry Balloon, would call me on my cell phone while I was sitting on the floor of the House and say, you better not vote to take away that exemption, because there's going to be a bad story written about it tomorrow.
One of the interesting numbers that economists like to follow is the percentage of consumer spending that is spent on things subject to sales tax. And it has been steadily declining. Why? Because sales tax started out as a tax on tangible goods, clothing, you know, furniture, household items, and where the growth has been in consumer spending is on services. And so what other states have done is broaden the number of services that they tax. We're one of the lowest states in the number of services that we tax. I picked New Mexico for comparison purposes because their income's about the same level as ours, and for every percentage of sales tax, they were generating something like 70% more revenue because they have a very broad coverage of services, and we don't. So I think that's a place to look for revenue. Along with, I like Bob's idea of scaling it down, reducing the amount of the exemption, but I also think we need to take a close look at what's happening in services, because that's where we've been missing the boat. And of course, there's always cars, boats, and airplanes.
Yeah.
$300 cap.
Right. Are there any other questions? Yes.
I wonder if you would just, you said all of
You could. We would just bring the microphone up, so we want to make sure we hear you.
All of you have mentioned some possible ways of working on this problem. Could you sort of summarize what you see as the most possible, probable, if there are any ways of beginning to work on this problem?
Mine would be a variation on Act 3627, the House proposal, that reshapes how we fund and distribute the funding of education in our state. Again, that would address your concern about the 2 nuclear power plants in one district and that district benefiting and not the rest of the state. And again, the uniform millage rate, the leveled playing field for economic development across our state as well, as a whole host of benefits from pursuing that course.
I always go back to the sales tax, because that's the workhorse. That's the tax that people seem to object to the least. And if we can generate, the nice thing about broadening the base of the sales tax, not raising the rate, it's high enough, but broadening the base of the sales tax, is that it generates more money with the penny for Act 388. It generates more money with the penny for the Educational Improvement Act we passed in 1985. It generates more revenue for the 29 counties that have local option sales taxes, because they're not getting their aid to subdivisions from the state fully funded. So it spreads it around, and it generates the basic 4% that we started with. It generates more revenue for the general fund, so that helps deal with the drain on the general fund. So I think the sales tax really has a key role to play here. The other thing is rolling up all of the funds, and they're looking at this, at least to some degree, rolling up all the education funds into a single package. Right now, there's so many sources, and they're so confusing, and they're all distributed differently. So where we're trying to help poor districts with equalization, with EFA, it's getting to be a smaller and smaller percentage of the whole package. And with Act 388, it threw equalization the other way. So if we can wrap it all up into a single package and say, this is our target for what students can have. If your district wants to supplement it, fine, but this is our target for what districts should have. And let's roll it up. And so it's easy for us as taxpayers and citizens to understand, and there's some degree of fairness in the process.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be coupled with some restructuring inside education, with the state finding other ways to generate revenue. The sales tax exemptions get talked about, and that probably is the least painful. But I think ultimately we've got to look at how a state pays for education, and not how individual little school districts figure out the solution on their own. So there are people that say, I don't want Columbia to collect the money because they'll keep it. You know, I'll tell you that the problem with not allowing Columbia to solve the problem is that school districts are left to do it on their own. And, you know, the problems in school districts vary from a fast-growing school district to the small rural school district that's shrinking, that couldn't get a bond referendum to pass if they, you know, spent 10 years trying to get it to pass. So the problems are so different, and to allow districts to do it on their own is probably not a solution. But if school leaders don't realize that it's time to make some changes, I don't think the General Assembly is going to be willing to do it.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, being part of this. Thank you all for coming. I know that you've shared a wealth of information, and thank you for sharing your knowledge about, as we revisited Act 388. Thank you all for coming, and safe travels home.
And